Richmond grew from being the last port on the James River to the capital of the Confederacy. It was graced by large estates, bustling canals, and a profitable ironworks industry. The Civil War fires set by the departing Confederate soldiers to prevent the taking of weapons stockpiles left much of downtown Richmond in ashes. Although enslaved Africans were freed, the rise of Jim Crow created and maintained racial segregation nationwide. In many communities like Richmond, restrictions and discriminatory real estate practices relegated blacks to the worst parts of town. Roads literally stopped at the border of many black neighborhoods, shifting from pavement to dirt. Water, sewer systems, and other public services that supported the white areas of town frequently did not extend to the black areas. Richmond's street improvements and public transportation by trolleys helped merchant whites add a new white middle class to establish suburbs in the North Side, the Fan, and the South Side. A 1938 study showed approximately one-third of the city's 43,000 housing units lacked indoor toilets, and nearly half had only cold water. 635 units had no water at all. These conditions were prevalent in low-income neighborhoods. This 1937 map of Richmond highlights more and less valuable neighborhoods. The color red indicates neighborhoods with an undesirable population, often a code word for Negroes. The yellow color indicates marginal and degrading neighborhoods, often populated by white laborers. One of the reasons for the degradation of the yellow neighborhoods is their proximity to the red ones. The impact of fencing in the poor in the 1930s and 40s is still felt today. The red and yellow areas from the HOLC map are merged here in the red column, representing foreclosures during the recent recession. Notice that many of today's public housing units are built in those same red neighborhoods of yesteryear. In its early years, public housing was occupied by factory workers, teachers, and other employees who regarded it as a stepping stone to home ownership. Over time, changes in local and national policy profoundly altered their character as the poorest of the poor, predominantly black families, were concentrated in these developments. The Richmond Housing Authority was created in 1940, and the next year work was begun on Gilpin Court, an 8-block area north of Broad Street, in which 319 old homes had been condemned as substandard. Over the next several decades, public housing projects built included Creighton Court, Hillside Court, Fairfield Court, Whitcomb Court, Mosby Court, and in 1970 the Blackwell Community Project. These projects were occupied predominantly by poor black families.
When you talk about healthy, diverse communities, when the masterminds, the planners of Richmond built, well, we have at least 4 housing developments, I guess within a two-mile radius. Mm-hmm. What happened, they brought in a lot of low economic renters and subsidized renting, and it also brought a lot of the problems that exist today. Well, the one thing about building these communities, there are no resources there. There are no jobs in the area, and there is not transportation out of the area to where the jobs are in so many instances.
So much of the public housing or affordable housing that they paid for was awful. I mean, some of the public housing in the Housing Authority was built back in the earlier part, 60s and 70s. They were built so that whenever a family moved out, they could hose it out like a pig pen. Yeah, they were built with cinder block, and that's what happened. So that tells you an attitude about what we thought about people who were low income. And of course, needless to say, what East End of Richmond, the biggest concentrations of poverty, and it's principally because so much of our public housing the affordable housing was put there, not spread around or not tried to put in different areas.
So my father was a civil rights attorney and was one of the team of the Brown case in the 1950s. And he also was very politically active with the Democratic Party. And so he had worked on the campaign of John F. Kennedy. And when Kennedy became president, he gave him an appointment in the FHA in the intergroup relations department. And so my father would travel around the country looking at patterns of segregation in housing and ways of combating that. And one of the things that always struck him was how purposefully the housing was created to create these pockets of poverty. He talked particularly about public housing and public housing projects like Cabrini Green in Chicago, where you had these huge high-rises, masses of humanity with no amenities, no air conditioning, concrete blocks building. And he saw this pattern over and over again all around the country, including the housing projects here in Richmond. And so it always struck him as short-sighted to create these environments where there's no attention to aesthetics, no attention to comfort, the idea that there had to be somehow bare bones because these people didn't deserve anything better. And I think we're seeing some of the after effects of that now with this entrenched poverty that starts to build in these housing project areas.
Federal Housing Administration money, the GI Bill, and highway construction money fueled post-World War II growth of suburbs and the movement of commerce away from the city. The construction of I-95 in Richmond displaced 7,000 people and businesses, representing 10% of the Black community.
When Interstate 95 was, well, it just cut a swath through the north side of Richmond, Jackson Ward. People on this side were cut off from people on that side, except at points where they built crossing. And again, it happened when the Downtown Expressway was built.
By and large, throughout this time, neighborhoods in Richmond were segregated.
Richmond is a much more racially conscious area of the state than any other place I've lived. Well, I remember even as a child. In the West End, my mother sent me to a store, and I got lost. And I had to walk through a white neighborhood, a neighborhood that was predominantly white, and I was scared to death. I'd gone to a black school, I went to a black church, I lived in a black neighborhood. There was not any mixing of the races.
School integration in the late 60s and 70s fueled more white flight from the city and fostered new developments in the counties. As a result, some formerly white Richmond neighborhoods opened up to blacks. But moving in was not always easy.
We were the first black family to move above Brooklyn Park Boulevard. And we bought a beautiful house there on Lamb Avenue. About 10 signs went up on the block. So they couldn't go anywhere. Most of them, they just did that to register their disgust that a black family had moved on the block. There was a great flight. And that's what happened to the north side area. It just, I guess, it disintegrated, as a community.
Well, when I was growing up, you were pretty much contained in an all-black world. I lived here on the north side of Richmond, and within a block we had basically everything we needed. The local grocery store, local restaurant, local pharmacy, all black-owned businesses. The neighborhoods were very mixed from a socioeconomic standpoint. You had lawyers and construction workers and plumbers and teachers all in the same block. So there was a real sense of community there and, a sense that we're all in this together. And there was a very stark boundary around that community. I mean, the northern boundary for us was Brooklyn Park Boulevard. When you crossed that boundary, you were now into the white world. And North Avenue was another boundary that demarked the black community that I grew up in. And that started to change a little bit in the late 60s, early 70s. Gradually, that was a time in Richmond when busing was mandated for desegregating the schools. And so it started an exodus of white families from the north side of Richmond, in particular, where I was. And so as the white families moved out, you started to have black families migrate toward the north. And my parents moved from a house on AllBlack Road where I grew up to a house about maybe 10 blocks further north on Noble Avenue, which had been part of the all-white neighborhood earlier on. And when they moved in, they were one of the first black families in the block. And some of their neighbors weren't that welcoming. There was one neighbor who would cross the street every time he would see my parents, so he wouldn't have to acknowledge them at all. But gradually, the block they were in started to have more and more black families move in. But blocks further north still remained predominantly white, even though it became mixed.
Richmond annexation battles and slum clearance programs in the 1960s reduced city housing options for the poor even further. One major urban renewal program displaced 1,300 African Americans in North Richmond. Each family received a $5 relocation allowance and the privilege of moving into a housing project. Public housing was not available in the counties. In addition to discouraging the development of low or mixed income housing, zoning practices that established large lot sizes put many neighborhoods even further out of reach for families with moderate incomes.
We were raised in the 500 block of 7th Street, which is where the Richmond Coliseum is now. That was an African American neighborhood, and as time went on, the city looked at that property and it had desires for redevelopment, and so the families in the neighborhood were given offers to buy their houses so they could be relocated. And that's when my family moved from 7th Street to Churchill.
Founded in 1971 to resolve complaints against rental agents for discrimination under federal law, Richmond's Housing Opportunities Made Equal, more commonly known as HOME, also challenged the redlining practices of the home insurance industry.
First, when I came to this town back in 1970, I really fell in love with the beautiful architecture and great quality of housing in the Fan District, in the North Side. I was looking for a job, as any immigrant would do when they arrive in the United States. I was very fortunate that I had a job in the next, like the first 3-4 weeks when I arrived, and was looking for an apartment to live close by to work. Chamberlain Avenue seemed practical and logical because it was served by a public transportation to downtown. And I would call the landlords along the Chamberlain Avenue back. This was in maybe late December, January of 1971, and look for apartments since I thought, I could even bicycle to work or take a bus, as opposed to investing money, which I didn't have, in a car. The apartment owners were very courteous on the phone. They would say, yes, we do have an apartment, and I would make an appointment to go see. And the answers that I would consistently get was, we're just so sorry that the apartment is rented out. I can understand, the first apartment or the second apartment, but when you get this consistent answers from the well-meaning property managers or landlords, I felt that it was very strange that whenever I would go and show my face, the apartment would be rented. then I discussed that with one of my colleagues at the work, and she called, and she was shown the apartment, and she was a white lady who was my colleague at the time, and she said, well, TK, I could rent one. So then I really did understand that the landlords just didn't like the color of my skin or the way that I talked, because I still had a very heavy South Indian accent when I used to speak back in the 1970s.
There's no question there is a lack of affordable housing. And let me just say decent affordable housing, that people where they want to live, they're not afraid to live. And people with disabilities have special needs, and you know it's not the same as if someone that's fully able-bodied and they can get into places and so on. We need more rental housing. We need affordable rental housing. Every administration we've had for 50 years, they're all for home ownership. Well, I'm for that too, but that's not what everybody needs right now. Often, good rental housing is the first step to home ownership. There's no question that our housing problems, that we could list many of them, Betsy, could be made much better if there was regional cooperation around this issue. There is very little or none. A lot of times, Henrico and Chesterfield get a black eye, particularly Henrico, over this issue, that somehow but Henrico has by far more rental housing than Chesterfield ever thought about having. Chesterfield developed almost all single-family housing. That's an overgeneralization. Henrico developed lots of apartments. We have lots of apartments. Some of them were Section 8. Some of them were, have a lot of very large complexes. However, that's all in the past. We need to deal with today. The city of Richmond, one of the great difficulties in the eastern end of the city of Richmond, the concentration of poverty in those housing developments, the public housing and the rest, is a huge problem for the region, for the city.
Between 1999 and 2001, Richmond Redevelopment Housing Authority demolished 440 public housing units as they became obsolete with deterioration. The RRHA is currently moving forward with plans to redevelop Gilpin Court as a mixed neighborhood with proximity to the VCU Biotech Park and to downtown. The project is controversial.
The area of regional cooperation or regional synergy, I think, is most importantly in the area of education, public education. I've had people in my own neighborhood who I love dearly, who love the city, and their kids get to a certain age and they still move out to a county. What I think is critically important for us all to know and to really get came out of a study actually at Harvard as they were looking at 50 years past Brown v. Board. So it was 2004. It was a study that led up to 2004. As they studied, what is this impact? We've thrown kids together. What difference does it make? What they found was, I thought, astonishing. In that, and they call it inter-ethnic contact, each contact. Every contact a child has, a young adult or a child has, therefore with someone different ethnically, racially, in a big way, makes an impact. And they began to weigh and look at those. It has to do with cognitive learning, certainly interpersonal skills, but actually academic skills, academic skills and building relationships. As they began to continue to follow some of the students and see, it gave every student that had more contact, even if those contacts weren't all positive, a step ahead. Now, yes, we all know, I'm very committed. We need to provide that for young people that have no access and no resources. But if you're a parent and you own a company and you have a good living and you know you want your kids to be international attorneys or run big corporations and you have at your fingertips free a whole possibility of giving them a step ahead of all the other kids like them who are sequestered in some absolutely isolated environment where there's no one different. They actually will do better in the future.
Suburban counties continue to pass regulations that restrict diversity to a level that makes low-cost housing unattractive financially. Thus, private developers are not interested.
The region has not really addressed this issue of connecting jobs, transportation, education. It's a mismatch of resources, and also there hasn't been an honest conversation about really looking at this challenge of creating a great city. Because I think people are afraid to cross their turfs. Although there has been a lot of progress made in many areas, like creating an airport or waste management systems. But housing is a very sensitive subject, especially in a city where race has played a very prominent role for almost 200 years. But the fact is that many of the working families who reside in Chesterfield, they spend close to 25 to 30% of their income in commute. So on top of what they have to pay for housing costs, the land use and zoning approvals that they have in the counties does not encourage development of mixed use, mixed income development.
When I was at VCU back in the 70s, we talked about new communities, the flight to the suburbs, and we also talked about regionalism. And now that was, I guess, 25 or 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. Are we any closer today than we were then? I guess we have to start with officials. If they really wanted to create a regional system, they would have to start thinking more of community. I was reading someplace about the James River, what a jewel it could be for if there was some kind of regional cooperation between the entities.
Housing is another one of those issues. And I want to say that what we're talking about is quality of life issues. If people don't have housing, they can't find jobs, you need an address, or you can't get services, you need an address. Also, if you have housing that's inaccessible to your job site, you may have to spend an hour and a half to 2 hours on the public transportation that's available. When you talk about transportation and housing, it's very connected because you need access to housing sites. Right now, the city of Richmond has a huge concentration of low-income housing in the eastern part of the city, in the southern part of the city, south side of the city too. And one of the problems that have been discussed around deconcentration of public housing is housing choice vouchers. Well, housing choice voucher is great. You get your housing choice voucher, but you're still limited because you don't have transportation access to really find housing outside of regions that are on the bus stops. So, if there was a resident that would take the voucher or a realtor that would take the voucher, you've got to have transportation to get there. Then you have to have transportation to get to work. So it's all interconnected. We can't separate transportation, housing, and services. It's all connected. If you cannot get if you do not have transportation, and I think it's documented that there's very few households that have more than one car in the city of Richmond. So I personally talked to a family that had one car. Mom worked at 7-Eleven And Dad worked at a plant in Chesterfield. So the priority, full-time dad working in Chesterfield, he got the car. Young adult was trying to get some part-time work. She didn't have public transportation, and she couldn't even get babysitting jobs because the jobs that were offered were like in Chesterfield or in Henrico, and she didn't have transportation. Mom was catching a ride to work at 5 a.m., and so it left the young adult who was trying to go to J. Sargent Reynolds and trying to supplement the income sort of limited in what she could do because of transportation. And they, by the way, live in Henrico County.
Despite all the bad news, a few new innovative neighborhood models are being built in the metro area. One example is Winchester Greens in Chesterfield County. T.K. Somanoth of the Better Housing Coalition describes this model.
For example, in Chesterfield County, we took a failed apartment complex that was subsidized by the federal government, and the private developer had turned the keys back to the federal government, so we bought that property in an auction when the residents invited us to help them to save those buildings. So we bought them, and then working with the residents in that community, went through a bottom-up planning process and have rebuilt this community with beautiful apartment homes, both for families and for seniors, and integrated that with a very state-of-the-art childcare center to serve almost 150 kids, from infants to the school-age kids.
You ought to look at Winchester Greens right out here in Chesterfield County. It's beautiful. It's one of the biggest examples of new urbanism in this part of the world. And it's affordable housing. And it's gorgeous. Porches, beautiful landscaping, meant to be conducive to kids playing in the streets. Anyway, so we can do this. It's not a mystery.
I think, a lot of it is educating, some of the policymakers. I think I agree with Mayor Jones that, the timing may be right to kind of restart some of those dialogues, because we are all in this together. There's only finite sources of resources that are available, and especially with the challenges in reducing the carbon footprint, some sort of public transportation is critical to serve the region.
The other thing we have to look at is services for people with disabilities, transportation and housing services for people with disabilities, and mental health issues. So they're trying to get to medical facilities that, if you notice, some of them are moving outside of the city limits. So these people also, I've talked to individuals who say, if my van can't take me on this day, I can't go for my mental health services, or I can't get to my doctor's services, or job training, if it depended on where it's located. I talked to a gentleman from Hanover County who tries to get a ride into the city because Hanover doesn't have the type of services he needs, but there are services in the city that would meet his needs with a local nonprofit. And he had transportation problems. He tried to find housing closer. He couldn't afford it because he couldn't find any place that he could pay the rent. He even looked into renting a room, and he really didn't want to do that, but he was that desperate to get close to services so he would have access to his services. So these are real people in our communities, and one of the things we can do as individuals who really care about our community is try to figure out how do we become a part of their story, and how do we take some action that would help create a better community for all of us.
What kind of community do we want to build for ourselves and for others? The discussion begins here.
1 week in every February is officially designated as National Brotherhood Week. This means that we're supposed to stop whatever we're doing, burning, killing, whatever, and love everybody else. And it's really quite a strain. Here's a song about National Brotherhood Week. Oh, the poor folks hate the rich folks, and the rich folks hate the poor folks. To hate all but the right folks is an old established rule, but during National Brotherhood Week, National Brotherhood Week, see Cassius Clay and Mrs. Wallace dancing cheek to cheek. It's fun to eulogize the people you despise, as long as you don't let them in your school. Oh, the poor folks hate the rich folks, and the rich folks hate the poor folks. All of my folks hate all of your folks. It's American as apple pie. But during National Brotherhood Week, National Brotherhood Week, New Yorkers love the Puerto Ricans 'cause it's very chic. Step up and shake the hand of someone you can't stand. You can tolerate him if you try.